Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. In today's archive video, we have the one and only Robert Hand discussing astrology and the Kabbalah. Now with my Mercury and Pluto connection, I was able to find this hidden lecture deep in our archives, and I tried to clean up the audio as best as possible. But if you do hear a bit of tinkering in the background, please forgive me. As a reminder, we have a number of fantastic workshops and webinars coming up. So if you'd like to learn more, please visit KeplerCollege.org. And lastly, if you're attending NORWAC this weekend, please stop by our booth where our president, Donna Young, and former president, Ina Newberg, will be there if you'd like to learn more about Kepler College. And without further ado, let's get into the video.
First of all, some introductory comments while we're contemplating the title page. This is not a practical lecture, I have to say this. That is to say, what you're actually going to do with your astrology when you've heard this lecture is not going to be immediately obvious. You may have some insights, to be sure, but this is primarily a lecture about the interaction between the Kabbalistic and astrological traditions in both the Judaic Kabbalah, which is, of course, the source and origin of all systems of Kabbalah, and to a lesser extent, the interaction with the well, it's Christian, but I would say non-Judaic Kabbalah, because in its later forms, it's distinctly not, it's not Christian either, but it's not Jewish, it's not Christian. However, so we're going to be talking about a lot of the ways in which these things have interacted and some important philosophical principles involved, but as I say, you may find this not entirely a practical lecture. This is just sort of a mood setter, to be perfectly honest. This is the Hebrew of the phrase, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, which is Rashit Chokmah Yirat Yahweh, or Yahweh. That's a word we don't really know how to pronounce, and I probably should have pronounced it Adonai, which is the convention. But since we don't know how to pronounce it, I don't think I need to worry about pronouncing it incorrectly. I've almost certainly pronounced it incorrectly. But at any rate, this is a fundamental idea behind all of these studies, that the more you know about the Lord and the more you fear is a word that we should probably regard with a certain amount of caution, because it's certainly not the fear of the kind where you shrink down and say, oh, this is terrible, this is awful. It's more like respect, awe, that kind of thing. All right, the word itself, and you'll notice I'm spelling it in a somewhat unconventional way. I'm spelling it in what is the closest thing to an English or a Roman letter transliteration of the original word. The original word is Kaf, which corresponds to Q, Bet, which corresponds to B, Lamed, which corresponds to L, and Hey at the end. And you remember, by the way, when you see Hebrew, it goes from right to left, not left to right. So the thing that looks a little like a P on the right is the Q. And so you can see why this spelling with a Q is actually better. There is only one L, there is only one B, and there is an explicit H. The common spellings with K are perfectly accurate from a phonetic point of view, but not strictly speaking from a linguistic point of view. The Hebrew language, as are all Semitic languages, has as their roots what are called triliterals. These are consonants which occur in threes with different vowels and then also prefixes and suffixes. The QBL, or Kaf Bet Lamed triliteral, has to do with receiving, and this word is often translated as tradition. Now, I'm going to briefly give you a little of the traditional history of the Kabbalah. However, I'm not entirely convinced that it's historically accurate, but on the other hand, who knows? The traditional is that it was handed to Abraham by God when God revealed who he really was to Abraham, and that it was to be handed down by word of mouth only from scholar to scholar, mystic to mystic, and according to the Kabbalistic tradition, it has been there all this time in the background. And in fact, it was believed that the Old Testament, when it was finally written down, was written down with Kabbalistic doctrine encoded in it. That behind the books of the Old Testament, especially the Torah, the 5 books of the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and some other books such as the Song of Songs and some of the prophetic works, these works were written in an attempt or not an attempt, they were written in order to encode Kabbalistic doctrine. And the actual text that you read when you read the text literally is not to be taken literally. It is apparent that somewhere fairly early on, people in the Jewish tradition decided that the story of Adam and Eve in the garden and all of that was not to be taken literally and could not be the foundation of a very high-level transcendent spiritual belief. This is one of the, of course, this reinterpretation of the Old Testament is precisely what separates Kabbalah from conventional Judaism in all of its forms. There are, of course, modern Jewish sects which still practice and teach Kabbalah, most especially some of the Hasidic sects, which are found in places such as Brooklyn and Israel. What they actually teach, I don't know, because at this point in time, they don't teach it to anybody who isn't Jewish. The Kabbalah as we know it, surfaces gradually between the late classical period and the 13th century. There is one work which I'll be talking about shortly, dating from the late classical period, that first mentions concepts that are familiar to Kabbalah, but the mature tradition surfaces in Spain and Provence, the south of France, and centers around a massive work called the Sepher Zohar, which means the Book of Splendor. And anybody who knows Hebrew, forgive my pronunciation because I am not a skilled Hebrew linguist. I do my best, but I'm not highly skilled at it. In the Sepher Zohar, the doctrine of the Kabbalah, in something like the form in which it is now generally known, surfaces. And the most raging debate about the Zohar is, was it written from scratch as somebody's personal fantasy? Does it represent a continuing tradition, or is it a direct revelation from God? This is not an issue I'm going to try to settle here. Although my own opinion is that while the book may have been written from scratch, it was based on a tradition that had been percolating in the underground all the way along, and I don't think it was written from scratch, that is to say, with no foundations in a tradition whatsoever. And the earlier work from the late classical period is excellent evidence of that, even though the Zohar is much more worked out than the material in the Sepher Yetzirah, which is the earlier work. So this is the tradition. Okay, now I'm going to take a tack at this point which is decidedly unconventional, because in my studies of late classical Neoplatonism I have discovered a similarity to Kabbalah that is so great, and it is written out in such detail, that it's fairly apparent that one of the following is true. Either Kabbalah is a Judaic form of Neoplatonism with a great deal of additional material from the Judaic tradition. There's no question about that. Or the Neoplatonic tradition and the Kabbalistic tradition come from the same source, and I won't even try to identify that. Because one of the fundamental ideas in Kabbalah is the idea of the worlds or levels. This idea is found almost precisely the same in Neoplatonism, starting with Plotinus, who wrote in the 3rd century A.D., and culminating in the works of Proclean in the 5th century A.D. These levels are described in Neoplatonism. They're called hypostases, which is the plural. Hypostasis is the singular, and it simply means it's the same root as the word substance, although to translate it as substance would be highly abusive to the sense of the original. They're just related words. At the highest level, we have the one, and I comment here, about which nothing can be said except that it is prior to all else and is the source and archetype of oneness, life, and consciousness. I must clean up that typo someday. We only need the source once. This is a slide I've had around. Most of the rest of the slides I created for this particular presentation. This is one of the few I brought over. The one generates another level. The word for these, other than hypostasis, is not, there's no other satisfactory word. So the one generates, through its contemplation of itself, a second hypostasis called nous, which is that which knows, and it operates in eternity. And it is in nous that we can only for the first time speak about true being as opposed to non-being. So we have in nous knowing and being, same and different, stasis and change, rest and motion. Nous, contemplating the one, generates psyche, which is basically nous, or that which knows, in motion, in time. So eternity becomes time. Then finally, psyche, contemplating nous, generates the physical universe. Now, there are many detailed levels here where this is a bit different from the Kabbalistic four worlds, but the similarity is so huge, and when I get to the next slide, you'll see just how huge. But not the next slide, it'll be the slide after this one. Sorry. The hypostases in Neoplatonism are reflected in the structure of the cosmos. The 24-hour rotation of the universe, as the ancients saw it, the prima mobile, we regard it, of course, as the turning of the earth, but remember, this is not a physical description of the universe, it's rather an experiential description. That turning of the universe is the turning of the one, and in fact, the word universe means the turning of the one, or the one thing that turns. The sphere of the fixed stars, which the ancients thought was a single sphere, all fixed stars with the same distance, corresponds to that which knows. And there is a tradition in the non-Judaic Neoplatonism that all souls descend from the sphere of the fixed stars. But the point I want to leave, we don't need to worry about the objects of knowledge, that's technical Platonism. Soul corresponds to the planetary spheres, and that's very, very important, because this and Qabalah both clearly agree that the planets that we study in astrology are not the physical bodies in the heavens. Yeah. Is everybody there? Are we still on? I'm hearing noises.
We're fine.
Am I still? Okay. Sorry about that. That the physical planets we see in astronomy are not what we study in astrology. We study their archetypes, which are patterns in soul. So when modern Jungian-oriented astrologers say that the planets are soul archetypes, they're absolutely right. There's just one difference. They're archetypes in the world soul, not the individual soul, or rather, not merely the individual soul. And then finally, we have the body, or cosmos, which is the sublunary sphere from the moon on down. Now here is the thing that makes it really look like there was a strong Neoplatonic influence on Kabbalah. After Plotinus, a later Neoplatonist, Proclean, whom I mentioned before, who wrote about the time the Western Empire allegedly fell in the 5th century, divided the one into a manifest and unmanifest one. The original one of Plotinus was primarily unmanifest, but not totally unmanifested. This led to the following: Proclean to Qabalah, the worlds. The left-hand column is Proclean's material. The right-hand columns are the Kabbalistic material that came from them. I've even actually heard it said by certain scholars whose scholarship I don't entirely trust, but they seem to have made the same observation I've made, that Qabalah is descended from not only from Proclean Neoplatonism, but from a particular species of Proclean, sorry, having a little word trouble there, Proclean Neoplatonism that surfaced in the writings of an unknown writer who called himself Dionysius the Areopagite. He claimed to be the friend of Paul, Paul had converted in Athens, and this book claimed to be by that disciple of Paul. The actual disciple wrote about within 100 years after Proclean and Christianized Proclean Neoplatonism. And some scholars have thought that maybe what Qabalah comes out of is a Judaic Proclean Neoplatonism. Now, I'm not going to say that's necessarily true, but the parallels are huge, and I will also say that we won't have a chance to get into all of this today because it's way too complex. There is, I'd say about 95% of Kabbalah is distinctly, totally, and completely Judaic. The only thing they seem to have gotten from Neoplatonism was this large overarching structure. And I have found the dialogue between Neoplatonic thinking and Kabbalistic thinking to be extremely fruitful in understanding both of them. It's like they give you different sides of the same whole. So, Proclus's unmanifest one became, in Kabbalah, the ayin, which is basically nothing, the Ein Sof, which is the unbounded, and the Ein Sof Or, which is the unbounded light. And these are three stages in the evolution of the unmanifest one. Now, I have a bit of a puzzlement here, because one of the things the Neoplatonists are agreed on is you can't say anything about the one that makes any sense in human terms. And how somebody managed to divide it into three parts, I'll never know. I would like to say clearly, however, these three parts are not to be interpreted as a kind of Kabbalistic trinity. There are three of them, all right, but they're not at all related the way the Trinity is in Christianity. Okay, the created part, the manifest one, becomes something called Atzilut, the world of emanations. Nous becomes Beriah, the world of creation. Psyche or soul becomes Yetzirah, or Yetzirah, formation, and cosmos becomes Asiya, or action. Now, before I go any further, I want to talk a little bit about these. The world of emanations is not one that one can say a whole lot about, so I will pass directly on. Beriah, I have read this in Hebrew dictionaries of all places, comes from a root which means to carve. And in this respect, it's clearly similar to nous, because it is in nous that we can first talk about the concept of being and non-being. And Beriah creates by eliminating possibilities. And lest that seem fairly weird, let me explain what I mean. I am somewhat infamous in my public lectures for talking about the cosmic pocket comb. And I hold up a pocket comb and I say to people, this pocket comb exists because of two fundamental facts. One is, in the space occupied by the pocket comb, there is a pocket comb. The other one is, in the space not occupied by the pocket comb, there is not a pocket comb. And the point is that for anything to exist, there has to be its equivalent non-existence. And carving away to create, I think you can see, is creation by making the distinction between existence and non-existence, or, as the Neoplatonists would put it, between the same and the diverse, or the identical and the diverse. So Beriah reflects this fundamental notion of nous quite well. Yetzirah is formation is a different kind of creation, in that it's by molding and shaping. The difference is Beriah creates the way well, I'll just be generic about it. Creates Michelangelo. The way Michelangelo created a statue was to see it in the marble and then remove all the irrelevant marble. On the other hand, a sculptor who works in bronze will make a clay model originally and mold it and shape it, and while he will from time to time carve away pieces of it, fundamentally it's a matter of altering the shape. It's fluid rather than scraping. And this is characteristic of the level of psyche or soul, and this has a rather interesting manifestation which we'll see in a moment. Asiya, or action, that word appears to correspond very closely to the Greek word praxis, which in Sanskrit is karma, the place of action. So the physical universe is kind of where it all happens. It's the end result of the entire process. An important point, by the way, is worth making here. As you descend from Atzilut to Asiya, the level of freedom decreases and the level of determination or determinacy increases, so that in the purely cosmic material world there is no freedom whatsoever. And you may say, well, what about free will? The answer to that is quite simple. We are not entirely in the physical universe. We live on the interface between psyche and soul, or cosmos, or putting it another way, between Yetzirah and Asiya. And at this point, you begin to see how these doctrines can lead you to how free will works in astrology. If you surrender to the totally material manifestations of things, you have no freedom. If you grow in consciousness and awareness and operate at the level of soul, which is living energy, you acquire freedom. And the higher you can go in meditations in this level, the more freedom you attain. Psyche, or soul, or Yetzirah, to use the Judaic term, is a level in which magic can operate, which is basically, to put it simply, a technology of managing soul energy. Not a way that you people usually think of it, but that's what distinguishes it, say, from mechanistic technology. Okay. Again, making the connections between the Greek and Hebraic traditions, we have the four levels, and we know in Neoplatonism that the four levels did in fact come from this triangle called the tetractys, which you see over on the left. At the top level you have one circle, or one dot, then two dots, then three, then four, and their total is 10, which is extremely significant, as you will see in a moment. 10 is what is called a triangular number. So is 6, so is 3, and after 10 the next one is 15, because the next row has to have 5 circles in it. Triangular numbers are numbers that can be arrayed as equilateral triangles. But the 10 is significant, and now you see why 10 and 4 are closely connected, because it takes 4 levels of this to produce the number 10. It would take 5 levels of this to produce the number 15, and so forth. But 10, I assume probably having something to do with the number of fingers, is the fundamental one. However, you find in Kabbalistic writings, and now here I have to plead ignorance, I don't know to what extent these doctrines are Judaic Kabbalism or non-Judaic Kabbalism, but the association is often, I'm inclined to think, for reasons I'll show you in a moment, that it is authentically Judaic. The absolute has only one archetype of an element. It doesn't have the element. The elements exist here in this world. But the archetype from which fire is generated is present in absolute. In Beriah, we have fire and air. And by the way, at this point, I want to make a comment about the Golden Dawn's teachings. The Golden Dawn teaches that Beriah is associated with water, and I need to remind anybody in this group who is a Golden Dawn person that the authors of the Golden Dawn material said it's full of blinds. That is to say, intentionally misleading elements for the unwary. Elsewhere, the tradition is clear that Beriah is associated with air. But notice there are 2 elements in Beriah. Absolute has 3 elements, fire, air, and water, and this is where you will see evidence shortly that the Kabbalistic doctrine did have something like this. And then, of course, Asiya is the realm of the full 4, fire, air, earth, and water, and that's why the 4 elements are associated with the physical universe. Okay. The earliest of the text that is considered to be part of the Kabbalistic tradition, at least by Kabbalists, is the Sepher Yetzirah, or Book of Formation. Sepher means book. Not to be confused, another term we'll run into, Sephirot or Sephra, I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, which it has the same triliteral but means something different. It means number or counting. The Sepher Yetzirah is the Book of Formation, and the reason I said, at least according to Kabbalists, it's one of the earliest books of the Qabalah, is that the scholarly viewpoint is Qabalah had no existence at all prior to the 13th century or the 12th century, and it sprang into being as a sudden evolution out of earlier forms of Jewish mysticism, in particularly a school of Jewish mysticism known as Merkaba, or chariot mysticism, which is which they claim is what the Sepher Yetzirah actually belongs to. There's just one problem, and that is the Sepher Yetzirah may not have intended the later doctrine of the Kabbalah, but the later Kabbalists adopted it completely. And in fact, Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say there's a brief question before, because you're about to head into another thought, and this is actually from your previous one. Why is
Okay.
Atzilah mentioned twice and Yetzirah not mentioned with the elements?
Did I make a mistake? That's possibly an answer. That's a mistake. Sorry about that. Here's what we can do. The wonderful. That is a boo-boo. Okay. This is what it should say. Thank you for calling my attention to that error. Okay. Let me just quickly save that. This is like doing a live lecture. Exactly like that. Okay, that's what it's supposed to say. I hope that satisfies the explanation.
Yes.
Yes, that's what it's supposed to say. Okay, or the question rather. This work was composed between the 2nd and 6th centuries, which makes it an extremely old work. This puts it up to 1,000 years before any later Kabbalistic work. It is this work which leads me to believe that the Kabbalah is actually a continuous evolution from the ancient world. Also, I see no reason to believe that some Spanish or Provençal Jew suddenly got the idea of ripping off the basic foundations of the Dionysius, the Areopagite, roughly 1,000 years after it was written. These people were knowledgeable about the works of the classical world all the way through, and I actually am not convinced that the Dionysius or the Areopagite connection is real. The Proclean might be. But Neoplatonic ideas, and also, I hasten to add, Jewish thinking, permeated the ancient world so completely that these syntheses occurred without anybody being really conscious of them. They didn't do footnotes in bibliographies. That's a modern thing. They didn't try to say who said it. If it came from a source that they believed in, that was sufficient. And so these ideas, I think, evolved slowly. I don't accept exactly the Gershom Scholem view of the evolution of the Kabbalah. I think it was a continuous evolution. But you see, there's a problem with these texts. Very often, there aren't a whole lot of copies of them, and they get lost, burned, eaten by worms, whatever. But I can't prove that. It just seems intuitively more likely that this would have been a gradual evolution. Aryeh Kaplan, the Sepher Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. Formation would be a better translation, but he used the word creation. He claims that this is basically and fundamentally a work of esoteric astrology. And as such, I was looking for the reference today. I know it's in there, but I couldn't find it today. As such, it is one of the oldest texts of philosophical or spiritual astrology of all. And it is apparently, although when you read it, you would never describe it as a practical work. But it is apparently, in very obscure and esoteric form, a work of practical meditation techniques. And Kaplan actually goes into what some of these may be in this work. This is, by the way, head and shoulders the best book on the Sepher Yetzirah there is. It consists of the Sepher Yetzirah itself and his commentary. And Aryeh Kaplan was an Orthodox Jew from Brooklyn who started out life as a nuclear physicist, had a conversion experience, and became a rabbi. And he has written a great deal on Jewish thought and the history of Jewish mysticism. And he was not only a profound Jewish scholar, he was a brilliant thinker, period. He has made connections, which I think we all need to confront. Regrettably, he was so orthodox he wouldn't teach anybody who wasn't Jewish. And I mention this in particular because Robert Zohar tried to become one of his students, and he wouldn't accept Zohar because he wasn't Jewish. Another author I'm going to mention does not present that problem. Okay, Yetzirah is the third world of soul. It's the third world, the world of soul. It contains only the three elements. The Sepher Yetzirah is a description of the world of psyche in which the material world is embedded. More specifically, it's a description of how the universe comes into being at the level of psyche. And basically, the universe comes into being by being thought and spoken. because thought, speech, communication, logos, these are all things of psyche. They are not things of the material world. Causation works differently in this world. Let me give you an example of Yetzirah level causation. Do you wake up in the morning because the hour hand and the minute hand are in opposition on the 12 and the 6? Are they mechanically waking you up? Well, if you have the alarm set, they might be. But you get up because you have made a mental commitment to get up at that hour, and the clock shows you a word, a logos, an idea that it is now that time. You get up. That's a kind of causation, but it's not mechanical causation. Similarly, when somebody calls you and you come, that is not mechanical causation. That's causation at the level of Yetzirah. So the world would be created by will, by thought, by idea, by language.
Well, there's a question related to that of why does the Yetzirah translate as Book of Creation when most call it Formation?
Well, the problem is the world. Let me give you an example. The first book, the first line of Genesis is, let's see, Bereshit bara Elohim. Actually, that is create. Sorry, that's not going to work. In the Bible, the roots for Yetzirah, are frequently translated as creation. I would prefer that he hadn't done that, because Yetziratic the creation from with the triliteral of Yetzirah is a different kind of creation from the creation of the triliteral of Beriyah, and I described the difference. And let's just say he didn't agree. What can I say? I have no good answer to that question.
Okay.
Okay, we're not going to dwell on this extensively, but the whole thing, not the whole thing, but a great deal of the material in Sepher Yetzirah revolves around the Hebrew alphabet, which, to put it mildly, was not regarded as an accidental creation by the human mind. It is interesting that for no particularly good reason, we have created a few other things like this with the same foundation. I'm sure many of you are aware in the tarot there are 22 major trumps, or major arcana. What you may not know is there were 22 major trumps or arcana long before anybody thought of connecting them to the Hebrew alphabet. And there is no evidence historically that the tarot cards were created by people with a knowledge of either Hebrew or Kabbalah. We seem to have a thing with the number 22. I mean, like 12 and 7. But 22 is a little less obvious why we should have a thing with it, but we seem to. The historical origins of the Hebrew alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet it is in fact a variety of the Phoenician alphabet. It is so completely a variety of the Phoenician alphabet that to this day, when scholars write texts in Phoenician, they use the Hebrew alphabet to write them. It is so much a Phoenician alphabet that in fact the names of the letters in Hebrew, the Hebrew alphabet are not actually the Hebrew words for those things. This alphabet is more Phoenician than Hebrew. I'm talking about the names and the structure. The actual forms of the letters are an Aramaic form which Aramaic also used the form of the Phoenician alphabet that came into general use in the around the in either late BC or early AD, I don't know exactly when. Aramaic continued evolving and eventually gave birth to the Arabic alphabet, which is also derived from this, but Arabic does not have only 22 letters. The reason why I say this is not, strictly speaking, a Hebrew alphabet is there are duplications and superfluous letters, and there are also letters missing. If this were really a Hebrew alphabet, there would probably be a one-to-one correspondence. But that's a scholar talking. The gathering around or accreting around this alphabet is a great deal of symbolism and lore. This is only the first half. This is the first 11 letters and what they mean. And one way of spelling them, you have the Hebrew, you have the translation of the name. Aleph, of course, is what eventually became A, B, and just to show you how strong an influence this had on the Greek alphabet. Aleph is alpha, Bet is beta, Gimel is gamma, Dalet is delta, Hey actually became eta, Vav disappeared, but it was not. But in early Greek, it was known as Thal. Zion. Zion is not the birth of Zeta. Tzadi is, which is further down, and so forth. It's not Yod, for example, is iota. There's another one, and Kaf is Kappa. So the Greek names of the letters of the alphabet are in fact derived from the Semitic names. However, Semitic alphabets to this day do not have letters to indicate vowels. Arabic has ways of indicating vowels, so does Hebrew, but they're not letters. They're signs placed under the letters or over them or somewhere. In Hebrew, they're placed under or within. Arabic, I can't comment meaningfully. Haven't studied it enough to tell you, but I know it's the same principle. Only the consonants have letters, but there are two consonants here which correspond to nothing we're aware of in English. One of them is Aleph, which is not the sound ah. It's the, if I pronounced like a lower class Englishman, butter, I would say butter. That sound in the middle is an Aleph. It's a stop at the back of the throat. It just stops the air for a moment. We don't think of it as a letter apparently needed in the Greeks. The Greeks eventually designed a symbol to account for vowels that were a continuous flow of air versus, which we would say is an H, as opposed to vowels which begin with the A. The very first sound of the letter A is Aleph, but it's not the A, it's the part. Bet is B, Gimel is Gimel, G, which eventually gave rise to the C in Latin, G and C, and so forth. This is the second half of the alphabet. Nothing really too worthy of comment here, but I'm going to back up for a moment here. And I want to call your attention to the, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but can you see my cursor, Enid? Are you there, Enid? Hello?
I am here. Your cursor is visible.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I have no feedback here. I don't know if I'm speaking to an empty space or not.
No.
Under the letter type, under the word type, you see mother, double, 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 simple, 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 double, and it continues simple, mother, simple, 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 doubles, simple, simple, double, mother, double. This is a genuine classification in the Hebrew alphabet, distinguishing among the various letters. And here's how it works. The three mothers don't have any particular grammatical significance. The doubles, on the other hand, apparently in ancient Hebrew and apparently in some of the more obscure forms of Hebrew surviving in the Arabian Peninsula, where we have some of the oldest pronunciations of Hebrew around, all the doubles had two pronunciations. Bet could also be pronounced vet. Gimel could be pronounced, we're not quite sure what the two sounds of Gimel are. It's either Gimel, Gimel, or Gimel, Jimel. Dalet is Dalet or Thalet with a soft TH. And those are doubles. The next double is Kaf, which can be Kaf or Chaf. The next one we have is Pei, which can also be Fei, or Pei or a P with an extremely powerful H after it. If you've ever studied French, you know that the French P is much gentler than the English P. Paris, as opposed to Paris. We have an H in H with our P pronunciation. It was either that the second sound was either that English way of doing P, and then the other was the French way of doing P, or it was Pei, Fei. Resh is a little more obscure. We don't know what the second pronunciation of Resh, but it's probably something like Resh, Hresh, with an H sound in it. And finally, we have Tav or Tau, pronounced both ways, which is Ta, Tha. Tav, Thav, a hard TH. Okay, this has really important significance, which we will now get to. So here are our three categories of letters, and here comes the astrology, believe it or not. We have three mothers, Aleph, Mem, and Shin. They are called. They are also correlated with the elements of Yetzirah. There's a passage in the Sepher Yetzirah which says, Mem hums, Shin hisses, and Aleph preserves the balance of breath between them. Now, Shin is fire, Mem is water, and Aleph is air. Those are the three elements of the level of Yetzirah. The fact that this system is found in the Sepher Yetzirah leads me to believe this correlation between the four worlds and the elements was in fact ancient. I don't think it was derived by non-Judaic Kabbalists in modern times. And as a matter of fact, one of Kaplan's meditation devices basically consists of you breathe in making a humming noise. Well, you just breathe in. You don't make a noise. I don't know if you can hear me breathe in, but that's the Mem. And then you breathe out. That's Shin. And when you go from to that pause is the Aleph. And they show up again in the Tree of Life, which I will be coming to before too long here. It's going along faster than I thought. The seven doubles. Okay, what do we have seven of in classical astrology? Well, we have seven planets. And yes, these are the planets. And here's what's really fascinating. By the way, the doubles, two of these actually have two symbols, Kaf and Pei. That has nothing to do with the two sounds. Several letters in Hebrew have forms that occur in words or at the beginning and another form that occurs at the end. You see it with Mem, this one that I'm pointing the cursor at is the beginning or middle form, and the final form is the second one. Similarly, Kaf, actually I've got these backwards. That's the beginning form, that's the final form, beginning form, final form. I've got these two backwards, but it's not serious. Same thing with Nun and Sadi down here. There I've got them also backwards. Oh well. That has nothing to do with doubles. That's my point. It's purely a way of writing. Like in English up until about 200 years ago, you wrote S one way at the end of a word, another way is in the middle of a word, and you have that wonderful phrase from Stan Freberg when Benjamin Franklin looks over Jefferson's shoulder and says, what does this mean, the pursuit of happiness? Because that long S used to look like an F. At any rate, enough of the humor. The doubles are seven, and the fact that they are doubles strongly implies that every planet has a double nature. And in fact, there are pairs of words associated with each of these. The problem is we don't know which pair is associated with which, and we don't know which of these are which planet. A study group that I belonged to for several years came to the conclusion that the usual idea is backwards. The usual idea is that Bet is Saturn, the order being Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, Resh, Tav, and Tav is the moon. I would suggest it's the other way around. Tav, remember, the word Tav means cross, as in cross of matter. That certainly has a sound quality. I mean, has a physical universe, Saturn quality. Bet, on the other hand, means house. Moon, house, see it? But the problem is the connection between the letters and their astrological counterparts has never been agreed upon in print. If you read different versions of the Sepher Yetzirah, and there are quite a few, they will all give you different correlations. Most annoying. However, I am going to show you something in a little while that will make this a little clearer. And by the way, the Golden Dawn version of these relationships, I believe, is absolutely, totally bonkers. If there are any Golden Dawn people in the group, my apologies for being so emphatic, but again, I want to remind you they did say they put blinds in, and I think this may be another one of them. But on the other hand, they have a lot of company because the authentically Judaic texts of the Sepher Yetzirah all disagree too. Okay, then we have 12 symbols. Well, what do we have 12 of in astrology? Signs of the zodiac. So these are clearly the signs of the zodiac, and I can't tell you I can't say the symbolism makes perfect sense, but He is Aries, Thoth is Pisces, and everybody agrees on these guys. So He is Aries, Vav is Taurus, Zion is Gemini, and so forth. You may ask what practical use this has, and my answer is I don't honestly know at this point. This is an area, I mean, I have actually found material in this that is practically useful, but this is a system of magical or tantric meditation, not a system of horoscope casting. Finally, we come to the thing that everybody associates with with Kabbalah, the Tree of Life. And on the Tree of Life, there are these 10 circles, or Sephirot, singular, Sephirot, plural, or Sephirot. I'm not, again, quite sure how it's pronounced because of the consonant problem, of the vowel problem. But one thing is abundantly clear. This is, in fact, a peculiar and unique version of a very ancient principle. Now, if you go down the right-hand side here, we have Keter, or crown, which corresponds to the prima mobile, Chokmah, or wisdom, which corresponds to the zodiac, for which reads sphere of fixed stars. We have this thing in the middle here called Ta'at, which I don't know if there are any references to it actually in the earliest Kabbalistic works or not. I will tell you what the Sepher Yetzirah says, and if this sounds a little bit like Monty Python, you're right. Monty Python's instructions for the Holy Hand Grenade are a very good parody of what in fact ancient writing is like. But the Sepher Yetzirah says, and I quote, "There are 10 Sephirot, not 9. There are 10 Sephirot, not 11." At least from the Sepher Yetzirah's point of view, that sort of precludes Ta'at being a Sephirah. But it's commonly put in, and that's where it's commonly put in as. And there actually does seem to be some authentic Kabbalistic lore associated with it. Okay, then we have Binah up here, and it's Binah, not Bina, which means understanding, and is correlated to Saturn. Then we go over here to Chokmah. Excuse me. Then we go down here to Chesed. We've already been to Chokmah. Slide down here to Chesed, and that's mercy, which is correlated to Jupiter. We go over to Gevurah, which is Mars. In the middle we have Tiferet, or beauty, which is the sun. Netzach, or victory, which is Venus. Not a very Venus word, I have to admit. But Netzach also means song in Hebrew, which is not the point usually made. And song, I suspect, is more like it. Hod is Mercury. Yesod, or foundation, is the moon, and down here at the bottom is the kingdom, which is Earth. And there is a concept in Kabbalistic lore that creation occurred because of a lightning flash that went from Keter to Chokmah to Binah to Chesed to Gevurah to Tiferet to Netzach to Hod to Yesod to Malkut. Now, if any of you have ever heard me lecture on the ascent and descent of the soul, you will immediately recognize that this is a standard piece of the stellar religion of the ancient world. Something that some scholars have talked about at great length, but has generally been overlooked by the more popular historians, is that all of the religions of the ancient world, outside of the primitive ones like the Olympian religion, had some version of this, which is the souls originally came from outside the spheres of the planets, usually Chokmah, or wisdom, the zodiac, and descended through each planetary sphere prior to becoming incarnate. You can see this in the Hermetic material. You can see it in the Chaldean oracles, which is a late classical, at least written down in the late classical period. I encountered it recently in 1996. Yeah, in the spring of 1996, I encountered it as part of a Sufi meditation at a Sufi ceremony in Istanbul, Turkey. And now, I can't say I was in presence of an extremely esoteric ritual, but the 7-stage descent of the soul was one of their doctrines and is still to this day. And it describes how the soul takes on the attributes of the planets as it descends through the spheres, finally winding up right here, which is Malkut, or Earth. And here again, we run into an interesting point. There are no malefics here. These Sephirot are 10 aspects of divinity. They exist in all 4 of the worlds. In fact, in the highest level, Absolute, they exist in a pure form. In Beria, they exist as collections of angels. Or archangels, more precisely. In Absolute, they are angelic orders and the planets. Here we go again with the planets being aspects of soul. And then, of course, in Asya, they are the physical planets, which, as I say, in both this and Neoplatonic doctrine, don't cause anything. They are simply effects of the movements of the archetypal planets. The planet Jupiter, huge as it is simply an effect of the alterations and mutations of the archetypal Jupiter in the realm of soul. This, as you can see, is a little bit far removed from mechanist materialist doctrines of creation. We believe if it's big and physical and has billions and billions of anything, that it is somehow more significant. I don't think the ancients would have accepted that view. So now, yeah. Now we come back to we see the tree of life again. The circles are the Sephirot, sometimes with an H at the end, because that's Tav. Okay. That changes.
There's a
brief
question about the tree of life itself that you have the drawing. Is it the Frater Akkad tree? I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right.
Frater Akkad. Yeah.
Frater Akkad. Okay, there we go.
Yeah. Most of the post-Renaissance trees of life are exactly like this one. Okay. So I suspect it is. Now, what might be different is there are some who insist on sliding everything down one for reasons of what I'll call design elegance. People will often put Saturn as Chesed and slide everything down one, which you saw it finally winding up in Malkut. I have seen this in some Latin texts from the Renaissance. I've seen a couple of other references to it, but the more I've gone into this, the more this seems to be the authentic tradition. And when you understand that it's actually a model of the solar system, with the prima mobile, the sphere of the stars, then Saturn on down to the moon with the Earth at the center, that is a common system in the ancient world. It's almost certain that this version is correct. I would be very surprised if it turned out not to be. Now, where the variations occur, getting to the next slide, is on what you do with the paths. Notice the paths. Okay. And here's where everybody differs. There's another typo. Let me just fix that. I can't stand it. Manifest. Some typos I can let go by, but not that one. Okay. Okay. I've already mentioned how the Sephirot correlate with astrological material. Now, if you were to count the paths, you will find there are 22 paths. Oh, does this remind you of anything? Well, I don't think the correlation between the tarot trumps and the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet is traditional. It may be quote unquote right. It may be correct, but it isn't traditional. We have to make a distinction here between what was originally intended and what is actually real. In the world of the esoteric, sometimes the newer understanding is maybe very well the more correct and the more real. That's another argument for another place and time. But I will say that the connection between the paths of the tree and the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are absolutely explicit. Absolutely explicit. It's there in the Sepher Yetzirah. Because there are 3 horizontal paths. See them here? This one up here is Shin, or should be in the correct systems. This one in the middle is Aleph, and this one down here is Mem. Shin is up near the head. Fire corresponds to the spirit. We breathe in the middle. You see, it's actually a map of the body. Air, and at the bottom is Mem, the digestion, the excretory tract, water. And then again, I want to remind you of the phrase from the Sepher Yetzirah, which says that Mem hums, Shin hisses, and Aleph holds the balance of air between them, the breath of air between them. And here it is, holding the balance between them. Now, there are those, according to Kaplan, who have also suggested that the correlation is that Aleph, Mem, and Shin are the whole vertical columns. But I think that's probably not right, because all of the other letters are clearly paths, and that would destroy this structure. Okay, so we have 3. Shin at the top, Aleph in the middle, Mem at the bottom. Those are the mothers. And we only have 3 because this is not the material universe. There is no Earth. There is nothing material here. Earth, remember, stands for materiality, not for soil or the planet. Now, how many vertical paths? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 vertical paths. Now, in more recent forms of Qabalah, nobody assigns the planets to the vertical paths. Yet it's clear that this was the intention. We don't, again, know which paths go with which planets. My study group that I belong to tried all kinds of crazy ways of doing this. It looks like it ought to be easy to figure out, but it isn't. It's not neat. But the point is there are 7 planets, 7 vertical paths, and unless somebody was being extremely nasty and devious, it's obvious that the planets have to go on the vertical paths, especially when we look at the oblique paths and discover there are 12 of them. So you see the paths have 3 peculiar systems. There are vertical paths, horizontal paths, and oblique paths. And there are 3 horizontal paths, mothers, 7 vertical paths, doubles, and there are 12 oblique paths, the simples. So I find it hard to believe in any tree of life system that doesn't make the same correlation, that doesn't make this correlation in some way. I don't care how it's done. But again, if we go to the Golden Dawn, and Golden Dawn is not unique in this respect, they just simply take the letters in order. They just simply take the alphabet in order and number the paths accordingly. There is no attempt to sort them out according to the structure of the tree. Now comes a really bad piece of news. This is the standard tree of life we see for the last 300 or 400 years, but it isn't the only one that we see. The work of Zev ben Shimon Halevi, otherwise known as Warren Kent, but his Hebrew name is actually really his name, because for those of you who are not Jewish, traditional Jews have a Hebrew name as well as a non-Hebrew name, and he's simply following that practice. He's had that name since birth. So Zev ben Shimon Halevi has unearthed a number of other forms, but he has found this one also. This one is one of the old ones, but it isn't the only one. And if you go onto the internet, you will find some alternative forms, none of which, however, seem to do what I think this ought to do either. Now, this could be an area where the Sepher Yetzirah and the later Kabbalah are simply different. I don't know. Something, comment, question?
I was just wondering if they all have the 22 paths.
They all have 22 paths.
Okay.
There is no question that there is a connection between the paths and the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The big, deep secret is, what is the connection?
Uh-huh. Someone also mentioned that there's 22 chapters in Revelation, in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, there are, as a matter of fact. That may come under the heading of a total non-coincidence. As a matter of fact, our group tried to make the correlation of what to which, and it didn't work very well. If you try to correlate the 7 cities to the 7 planets, it also doesn't work very well. What appears to have happened is, while these numbers may be astrological in origin, they became disconnected from their astrological foundations in various circles and just became abstractly interesting to people. 7 days of the week, of course, is astrological, but the other sevennesses that float around in traditional symbolism are not always reliably connected with their astrological roots.
Mm-hmm.
So, the paths are also astrological. They are also letters. Now, if I may depart from my slideshow for a moment, I'm going to show you a work. This is not a slide. This is a PDF file. Whoops, I have to minimize that screen. Am I still on the air, by the way? That is, can you still see my screen?
Your screen is still there.
No, I can't find it. It's what I'm simply going to show. If I could find it, was a Latin, but it, since I haven't translated it anyway. Okay, back to here. I was going to show you a Latin astrological text that does combine Kabbalah and astrology, and at some point it would probably be well worth translating. It's 16th century, which makes it not quite traditional. It's one of those that, in fact, slides all the planetary correlations down the tree one notch. Okay, so I'm going to share with you once I fire this thing up again.
Okay. Is Warren still living?
Yes, he is. I'm happy to say. As a matter of fact, I have here a reading list, and quite a few of the books are by him. As a matter of fact, I was just on a website today. He has apparently got things very well organized, and it has revised and republished all of his works. The newest revisions are available from this address down here, Watkins Books, 1921 Cecil Court, London, and there's a website you can go to see about the books. So all of his stuff is in print. Earlier versions, however, are a bit more readily available because they're in print in this country. Sepher Yetzirah, actually that's Kaplan. The Kaplan book is here. Sepher Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, that's very much in print. And while I recommend it highly, I got to warn you, it's not exactly a bedtime reading book. It's a book that I describe to people is once you start reading it, you will never stop. You will never totally master that book. It's a really fascinating, bizarre, and far-out book. Of course, you may conclude that it's a lot of BS and just put it away. It's a reaction I could understand, but I advise you not to take it because if you're interested in this material at all, this is a very hot book. Introduction to the Qabalah, the Tree of Life. That's Halevi or Kenton's basic book. The American version is available from Red Wheel. Yeah, I guess that is Red Wheel Weiser. It's Red Wing, isn't it? I may have that. Sure. I think it's Red Wing Weiser. I must have copied that wrong, but I thought I just cut and pasted it. At any rate, these are all available. These two are available from Amazon. So is the Arya Kaplan. The Kabbalah and Astrology down at the bottom is available at this point only from Watkins Book directly. The Amazon has it as out of print, and it's called the Anatomy of Fate is what it was originally called. Now it's Kabbalah and Astrology. And Kenton actually does have a system for putting the chart on the tree and making some sort of sense out of it. I have to say that I am a great fan of his work, but this book I have trouble with, partly because I think I formed my own ideas about how it should work, and his aren't like mine, and oh well. But Halevi, he is criticized by Orthodox Kabbalists because he is trying to make the material available to everyone. Now, so is Rabbi Philip Bird, of course. He is broken out of a Judaic-only mold also. But I have to say, Kenton once said to me, what we've got to do is save Kabbalah from the Jews. And he is one, of course. But what he meant was from that exclusivism. He's a very lovely man, very bright, really warm and human, and I think a genuinely wise being. And he has a Kabbalistic institute also. And if you're going to study the Kabbalah, study with this guy. Here is the profoundest compliment I can pay to him. I read The Tree of Life and I said, boy, is this simple-minded. And then I realized after reading a while, I said, no, it's not simple-minded. It's incredibly clear. you know, when you read books on the esoteric, you expect them to be insanely obscure. And this one wasn't. He's also written a book on the Qabalah that is available from or used to be available, at least from Thames and Hudson, that is actually a very nice little introduction. But the introduction of the Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, is his basic work. Kabbalistic universe is almost in the same league as the Sepher Yetzirah. That is, you start reading and you start going, oh my God. I particularly called to your attention his analysis of the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And Kaplan has one too, and it's really quite astounding. The word Elohim in the first 2 chapters of Genesis occurs 32 times. 32 is the number of paths plus the 10 Sephirot. There are 3 acts of creation. There is, in the beginning, God created. Then the second one begins with let there be light, where he gets explicit. The third one says, and then a mist rose up above the land and watered the ground. Those are the creations at the level of Absolute, Beriah, and Yetzirah. But it gets much more details than that. There are amazing correlations between the first 2 chapters of Genesis and the structure of the tree, which is not so amazing when you realize the structure of the tree may be derived from the structure of the first chapters of Genesis. But my standing joke line, no irreverence intended, is that Genesis was written by James Joyce in a previous incarnation. Because it's just like Finnegan's Wake. It's going on at 3 or 4 levels at once. There are puns, there are plays on words, and then, of course, if you read articles on the Qabalah on the internet, the one on Wikipedia is actually quite good, their introductory article. You will find all kinds of ways in which Kabbalists have done exegesis on the books of the Bible and generated a system which I think one could say without fear of contradiction doesn't have a whole lot of resemblance to Rabbinic Judaism or Christianity or any other contemporary religion. But what makes the Kabbalah really interesting and really fascinating is that it is the only advanced system of the Western mystery tradition that has survived to this day largely intact. It's just a little hard to get at. And people like Halevi, and even though Kaplan wouldn't teach Jews, he certainly was perfectly willing to write about the material and to throw out some very large bones to us, and for that I will be eternally grateful. The man clearly knew something. And like I said, it's one of those books that speaks to you, and then you find yourself speaking back to it, and the book changes what it says. You actually have a dialogue with this book. It's the only way you can read it. If you just try to read it like watching television, you will get nowhere.
Well, there's a question from someone from Amsterdam wondering if you know of the human design system which combines traditional astrology, the Chinese I Ching, and the Kabbalah.
I've heard of it, but that's all. I've just
Okay.
heard of it, yeah.
Sounds like an intriguing combination.
Yeah, it's the kind of combination that would probably drive the adherents to all 3 systems totally nuts, but that's all right. I don't have a problem with that. What you run into in all of these systems is fundamentalists. Now, a fundamentalist Kabbalist is a real super stretch, I have to admit, because it does not lend itself to. It started out as a non-fundamentalist way of dealing with the Bible, but you run into people who believe that everything must be done just so. And one thing this will sort of be my parting shot here. One thing you do need to know is there are in fact several different traditions of Kabbalah. At the time of what we call the Renaissance, the early modern period, an Italian nobleman named Pico della Mirandola studied Hebrew and read the Kabbalistic literature in Hebrew. He was the first Gentile to do so that we know of. At about the same time, a German whose name escapes me at the moment, but I have his book right next to me, but I don't want to reach for it just now, defended the Jewish community in the city against persecution by a particularly narrow-minded Dominican who just happens to have been a former Jew, and basically saved the community from persecution, and they rewarded him by teaching him Hebrew and the Kabbalah. Now, at this point, we have a certain kind of Kabbalah. Then in the Jewish world, there was a major revolution at the hands of one Isaac Luria, who I don't know if he created something new, had a new revelation, or found an old tradition, but contemporary Judaic Kabbalah is post-Lurianic. Kenton's Kabbalah stops at about the time of Pico. The Kabbalah of the magical systems like the Golden Dawn is descended from Pico, and Reuchlin is the German's name, Joachim Reuchlin, is descended from their Kabbalah. When people say that magical Kabbalah is not authentic Kabbalah, what they usually mean is it's not Lurianic. Other people have said, however, that the spirit, at least, of what the Golden Dawn was trying to do with Kabbalah was authentic and correct. The details probably weren't. And just to give you a little heads up, a major work is forthcoming from Liz Greene. This is under the heading of Now for Something Completely Different. Liz Greene, as you may know, is working on her second PhD. Her PhD is on the arrival of Kabbalah in 19th century French and then 19th century English occultism. And she has found that, contrary to what you've read, you'll read in almost all of the scholarly books, the Kabbalah that surfaced in 19th century France and was transmitted to England was not warmed over Pico and Agrippa. It was, in fact, gotten from Orthodox rabbis in Paris who knew what they were doing. And she has documented this. She has identified the people, noted all of the areas of transmission, and this promises to be an extremely fascinating work of Kabbalistic scholarship. And I have to say that if it continues going in the direction it's going, she's going to turn the world of Kabbalistic scholarship on its head. So for anybody who thinks that Liz Greene is an intellectual lightweight, I wish to offer you this conclusive proof to the contrary. The woman is a profound scholar when she turns her mind to it, and a profound thinker, even otherwise.
Well,
okay.
There's one other one where someone has read of an inverted tree of life as a mirror image. Yeah.
Yes. That's Lurianic. I don't think that exists prior to Luria. It may, however. I'm not going to make that a definitive statement. That something went wrong in the first couple of creations, and our creation was the third or fourth. And out of it came this sort of dark parody of the tree called the Kalipot, or Clipot. It's got all kinds of transliterations, which, as I say, is a sort of dark parody of the tree, and it's upside down. That is an authentic Kabbalistic tradition, although I think it's a relatively late one.
Does it also have the same astrological connection?
I imagine it would. It would probably be the dark sides of every one of the planets.
There's another question. This one is in being intrigued between the three mothers and the Sanskrit as well as the concept of sound as causal creation of the seed mantras in the Hindu tradition.
I can tell you right that I know of no historical connection, but they've got exactly the same idea. You also find in Egyptian literature. Ta created the universe by speaking it. Again, I think we're talking about creation on the level of soul rather than the physical universe. But on the other hand, the soul-generated universe generates the physical universe. Something for people to keep in mind. Assuming that physical laws are not hallucinations created by physicists, and the evidence suggests that while they may be imperfectly expressed, they are not hallucinations. What is it? What is a physical law? What is the substance that it consists of? And the answer is, it's an archetype. It's a form. It's not material at all. Lurking in the middle of hardcore science is some of the most gigantic Platonism the world has ever known. And these things can only exist because there is soul to comprehend them. So at some level, soul is in fact generating the physical universe. It's just a little, you don't have to get terribly esoteric here to see it. But scientists, I assure you, do not for the most part. I'm sure there are some who do, but at least in the public literature, they do not see this. They see physical law as being substantial in some peculiar way. I think actually what physical laws are is approximations of the behavior of nature, but we express them in a language which is entirely non-physical, the language of mathematics. Okay, one more thing. I'll be happy to answer some more questions, but I want you to have this, not because I'm trying to drum up business, but if you want PDFs of the slides, send me an email and be patient because I'm going to be leaving town the day after tomorrow for a week.
Or actually, you could email the slide to me, Rob, and I could have it available with the recording for the period.
Sold. That'll
Okay.
be so much simpler. Yeah.
Yes, that'd be the simpler route.
Okay. Any more questions before we give a final closing spiel?
One person was just commenting that the person with the question from Amsterdam that The Key of It All by Hulse gives some description of that inverted tree of life.
Yeah, you can find it in the magical literature also. I just don't happen to have focused on it very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, everyone, I'll have Rob send me the copy of the presentation. It will be available as well as the recording we're doing of the presentation right now on the Kepler website. So it takes about a week to get it ready to have posted, but it will be on the front page of the website and will be available for approximately a month.
And get yourself a good high-speed internet connection. Of course,
Yeah.
if you're here, you probably have one. Could I make a concluding remark here?
Certainly.
I want to remind you all, a little guilt trip here, this is a free event created by KeplerCollege with the assistants mentioned earlier. And if you really like these things, you have not been charged admission or any other fee, make a donation, however small, to KeplerCollege so that we can keep this and a whole lot of other things going. Speaking as chairman of the board.
Thank you very much, Rob. As president of Kepler, I will definitely echo Rob's comments.
And thanks to Christine for sponsoring this.
Yes, Christine Ahrens, her generous donation just definitely helped allow us to continue on with the last couple of free webinars. Thank you, Rob.
Okay, thank you all for coming.